Greetings historians, welcome to Lore of the Dragon. For those who have played the Legend of Spyro, you would have noticed the lack of dragons across the world, with there only being a handful of notable individuals that made up this mythical species. For those who might not know of their past, today's topic will hopefully be shedding light on what was considered to be the most powerful, yet peaceful race in the realms. Much like their classic counterparts, today we're going to be covering the dragons in the Legend of Spyro. However, due to the legend's tendency to leave things rather vague, I'll be speculating on what exactly their history could have been and take a look at their culture all the way up to the beginning of the very first Legend of Spyro game. First, let's go into the visual differences between the dragons of the Legend's continuity and the original continuity. A major thing to note in the Legend of Spyro is that all dragons stood on 4 legs. However, it would seem at certain points, a dragon could stand on their hind legs. For how long it would depend on the dragon themselves. It would be noted by Jared Polin, the lead concept artist of the first 2 Legend of Spyro games, that the dragons had opposable thumbs, but that detail never made it into the games. So this detail isn't exactly canon. The color of a dragon's scales, and even their eyes, are defined by their element, something of which comes from an entity of light according to Jared Polin, and would be bestowed upon them from even before they hatched. Orange would be fire, yellow electricity, light blue would be ice, and green, or something like sage, would be earth. And for a special kind of dragon, the purple dragon, their egg and scales would be colored purple, with their primary element being that of aether. From what we see in the games, fire, electricity, ice, and earth would be the dominant elements of the dragon species. The naturally gifted ones, anyway. Another detail to note is that the dragons of the Legend of Spyro, that's the one they're going to have for the rest of their lives, unless they're either a purple dragon or have been gifted more than one element by an external force. These are rather called natural elements for short. Anyway, back to the elements for a bit. Just because the Legend of Spyro doesn't mention elements outside the main 4, doesn't mean that other natural elements don't exist. In fact, wind is another element known to exist, along with something from the early development of the Legend of Spyro, and something Jared Polin said in a Q&A hosted by Dragon of Ice and Fire, the water element. While we never truly see a sole wind or water dragon per se, we do see Cinder actually possessing the ability to use wind in Dawn of the Dragon. Given it's her only natural element in that game, what Jared Polin said on the concept of Cinder, and what was told to him by the lead artist on The New Beginning, Bruno Rhyme, it could be implied that Cinder was actually a wind dragon originally, though it was never officially stated. Now, water dragons are, well, we've never seen one. But the only reason that it even exists in The Legend of Spyro is through the character of Cyril, the Ice Guardian. Now, I'll cover the position of Guardian in a bit, but the reason I bring him up is that in that Q&A that Jared Polin was in, Cyril was not actually supposed to be an ice dragon. He was in fact supposed to be a water dragon, and female. Like I mentioned briefly, the natural elements at some point were created by an entity of light, if we were to go with what Jared Polin said, though I would take this as non-canon. But either way, you can take it as you will. Now, it was also stated that there was the possibility of dark elemental dragons, ones harboring unnatural elements, ones created by a dark entity. An example of something like this can actually be observed with Cinder, and the powers she obtained after her corruption. The dark entity in this case being none other than Malefor. This could imply dragons having elements like poison, fear, shadow as their primary element, and could theoretically mean that Dark Guardians could exist, though nothing like that is ever shown to have happened. While we know of dark entities in the Legend of Spyro, we at least at a glance never actually see these light entities. Though, if we inspect the dragon's culture, we might get an answer as to who these light entities are. Now, starting with what seems to be their main belief structure. Across the lands, crystals that the dragons would call spirit gems popped up, which they both considered to be a gift from their ancestors, and would act as their life force. It would seem that because of this, the dragons of the Legend of Spyro don't necessarily generate their own magic like they do in the originals, as instead it comes from the world that they actually reside on, or at least to be more specific, comes from what we know as mana. As mentioned before, the dragons display a belief in what are called the ancestors. If we're going to go off the definition of an ancestor, then it would more likely be those of past generations who had moved on to what afterlife the dragons had. These ancestors then would guide those in the future, or gifting them with things like spirit gems, like I mentioned earlier. What they consider to be an afterlife is a bit unknown. In fact, the only thing that is known is what happens when the dragon perishes from the realms. This knowledge, only presented by the soul of the fire guardian Ignitus, would say that the dragons would become one with nature, join the ancestors in their eternal quests to give guidance and hope to those in the future. It is possible that these ancestors might have even been the light entities that I mentioned earlier, but given the light entity's non-canon status, this is really just speculation on my part. If you have any thoughts on that, feel free to leave them down in the comments below. Now for the less spiritual side of the dragons, and more about their society and customs. While a hierarchy is never truly stated, it would seem that individuals under the name of the Dragon Elders stood as leaders per se, as later when the apparent first purple dragon was mentioned and tutored by the Dragon Elders, they wore attire of elaborate design, and lived in what seemed to be a temple, though that's just speculation. Now what can be confirmed, whether this group existed before the time of Malefor or were created after, is not known. But personally, I speculate that they're actually descended from the Dragon Elders. The Guardians are warrior monks, and masters of the elements much like the Dragon Elders themselves, and protectors of the secrets of their respective elements. A non-canon part of the Legend of Spyro universe, once again, but interesting nonetheless, is the fact the Guardians were assisted by what are known as Dragon Knights. Think Templars, but dragons. These Dragon Knights consisted of various different orders, groups that all fought for the same goal. But unfortunately, these Dragon Knights would all seemingly be lost to history, as the darkest era in dragon history dawned upon the realms. In the Eternal Night, the second game in the Legend of Spyro series, it is mentioned by the character known as the Chronicler, an individual of immense age and knowledge, which could be speculated to be thousands of years old, met with the purple dragon of legend, Spyro. During this meeting, the Chronicler mentioned a collection of books called the Books of Time, and these books dated back to almost the beginning of dragon history, or rather almost the beginning of time as stated by the Chronicler himself. Now this brings us to something I actually speculated about in my Chronicler video, but I'm going to bring it back here and elaborate on it as it seems to be a decent starting point for this video. If what the Chronicler says is to be believed, then it could be conceived that the dragons as a species date back to nearly the beginning of time in the Legend of Spyro universe. How large this gap between the actual beginning and when the earliest records of dragon history started popping up will forever be unknown, as it's never clarified further in any game or any material following the Legend of Spyro. But if I had to speculate about early dragon history based on what facts there are, it would go something like this. Long ago, the dragons, along with many other races, started to establish themselves among these unclaimed lands. It would more likely quickly be established that the dragons were a superior foe to most, with their entire species having an innate ability to both fly and harness the elements of their world. But the dragons, despite their raw power, tended to not use their power maliciously, and were rather more kind and spiritual. It might have been through this peaceful nature that the dragons formed friendships with two species, the moles and the cheetahs, as displayed by this mural in Dawn of the Dragon. We might not have gotten to know when this alliance started, but it seems it lasted long enough for the moles and the cheetahs to start assimilating some of the beliefs of the dragons into their own cultures. The moles especially would form a tight-knit bond with the dragons, going as far as to even make cities for the dragons, and assist in defending it if need be. And the only account of this actually ever happening would be the city of Warfang. This city would serve as a bastion of hope, and a symbol of the Alliance's seemingly unbreakable bond. However, another group of creatures, known as apes, would seem to grow jealous of this power. However, given the strength of this alliance, the apes could never really do anything about it. But, eventually a day would come when they would get their chance to upset the power balance of their world. A time would come that a strange occurrence happened, the birth of a purple dragon, who would be named Malefor. The Dragon Elders at the time trained him with all the secrets and wisdom they had, hoping for him to one day be a symbol for all, a protector. But the dreams of such things would come to a brief halt. With his power, Malefor's arrogance also grew, to a point where the Dragon Elders saw it necessary to cast out the purple dragon, exiling him from dragon society. But little did they know what fate awaited them in the near future. Malefor, driven by resentment, led a war against the dragons, and anyone who would stand with them. Malefor's dark armies, now consisting of the apes that wanted to usurp the dragons, over time pushed back the dragons, and as the war raged on, the losses of the dragons skyrocketed. But as the dragons were pushed back, the cheetahs abandoned their allies, secluding themselves in the forests of their world, some even in the forests of a place called Avalar. They saw the war as a fight between the dragons, and with the destruction the war was bringing to their world, they decided to leave any and all dragon-based customs behind with their allegiance. However, there would be some later in the war that would elect to help the dragons, if only in small ways. The moles, on the other hand, stood by their longtime allies, from what we can see defending the dragon city of Warfang along its dragon inhabitants. However, it would seem that the wider range of fighting was left only to the dragons. During this war, a group of dragons only known to us by the ancestors vanquished Malefor, splitting his spirit and his essence, the former being kept within his fortress known as the Well of Souls, and the latter being kept in an alternative dimension called Convexity. Despite this victory, the Dark Armies pressed on, and for 1,000 years the dragons would be pushed back, with only Warfang seeming to hold. At first, all dragonkind rallied behind the single goal of winning the war, but slowly as it went on, it would seem this goal was no longer victory. It was plain and simple survival. Eventually the dragons were pushed back to what we know as the Dragon Temple, the home of the Guardians, and the place the dragons kept the future generations of their species. It was secluded in a swamp, far from the lands where the war might have started, and for many years it stood, unaffected by the war. Eventually the egg of the future purple dragon was safeguarded by the Guardians. However, word of the purple dragon might have gotten out, and the apes, led by their leader, King Gull, launched a raid on the Dragon Temple, ready to snuff out the last hope of the dragons. While the Guardians fought to protect the eggs, the effort was foiled by the countless apes that stormed the temple. With little time, the Fire Guardian Ignitus took the purple dragon's egg, and flew out of reach of the Dark Armies. But when he returned, he'd find that the rest of the eggs were smashed, leaving the hope of a new generation of dragons but a faint memory. The Guardians would then later fight in the war, with them and what remained of the dragons being pushed back to little more than isles. It would be during this time that another dragon appeared on the battlefield, one of monstrous power, a dragoness known as Cinder, the terror of the skies. Her origins would later be known to Ignitus, that she in fact was the only other survivor of the temple raid, but was infused with the powers of Malefor, forced to fight for him and King Gull. With Cinder fighting on the side of the Dark Armies, the orders of the Dragon Knights and the entirety of the dragon race seemed all but destroyed. It would only take a few more years before even the Guardians were captured by the Dark Armies, with only Ignitus escaping the clutches of Cinder. All hope to the lone Fire Guardian seemed lost, until one day he was found by the Purple Dragon, who now called himself Spyro. And while both him and the dragon race had lost so much, this meeting was enough to spark defiance within the Guardian once again, and hopefully finally achieve victory after 1,000 years of war. Now, this is a bit of a longer video, and quite honestly, a decent amount of it was, well, non-canon. But either way, I enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. Like always, if you have your own thoughts on this subject, feel free to bring it up in the comments. And if you want updates on when videos might be coming out, go ahead and follow me on Twitter. But anyway, that's gonna be it for me. If you want to see more lore videos like this one, feel free to stick around. And I'll see you all in the next lore video. Stay safe, historians.